Chris Chan for KaijuPop.com, and welcome to this video month in gaming history. And as we take a look back 30 years to November 1984, this was a really big holiday season for the Famicom, of all things. After a holiday of 1983, its first Christmas on the market, there weren't many games out. And in fact, all throughout 1984, there were maybe one, possibly two Famicom games, if you were lucky, sometimes zero. In November 1984, there were a whopping 7, thanks to output from Nintendo as well as third parties Hudson and Namco. So it all starts off a little bit nondescript with Yonnin no Uchi Mahjong. It's a Mahjong game. I still can't play Mahjong games, so let's move quickly past that one. Namco put out 3 games this month with Pacman. Everybody knows Pacman. It was a kind of a pretty faithful console conversion of Pacman, perhaps the most faithful one so far, with a slightly squished and altered maze in order to fit on a standard TV screen. But apart from that, a really good conversion of Pacman. They brought us Xevious, another faithful conversion of their 1983 arcade effort, and a good vertically scrolling shooter at a time where there weren't many of them. The novel thing here was that you could shoot and bomb targets with the B button using the crosshairs there. This was a pretty good conversion, although it had a few technical issues. You can see here the straight lines on the roads being a little bit unconvincing. You also had Mappy, which for whatever reason is a game that people tend to love and tends to show up on any of the numerous Namco compilations that are out there. It was sort of a maze-style Pacman game, but on a side-on perspective where you were a policeman mouse and having to deal with cats and stuff. It was kind of all about opening doors and then slamming them in people's faces and getting away and stealing things, and I couldn't get my head around it, so this didn't last long, sorry. But that wasn't all, as November saw Nintendo prepare a brace of 4, count them 4, first-party titles for the Famicom. First of these was F1 Race, a behind the car into the screen F1 style driving game that was a lot of fun, pretty good, and surprising it never really made it to the West, although probably by the time the Famicom headed west as the NES, there were better examples from Nintendo's catalog to bring over. But yeah, F1 Race was a pretty good game and an obvious attempt to imitate Namco's pole position, except with a slightly higher angle on the camera view there. It was perhaps lacking in visual fidelity and gameplay depth. You were just driving around the track against the timer there as you shifted between low and high gears and just trying to get as far as you can and try and beat the race within the time limit, as opposed to improving your position. The other cars were just there as obstacles, not to overtake and gain place and win a race per se. It was also kind of, I don't know, a little bit limited in terms of track design, or perhaps they were going for more with their track design than they could actually pull off. This sort of imitation of Suzuka's circuit here, which features a crossover that just disappears by the time you get round to the underpass there. But F1 Race was a pretty fun little driving game, and the first driving game on the Famicom. Up next, Urban Champion, the first sort of fighting game on the Famicom here. This was a bout between 2 urban street toughs, and the idea here was to punch people in the face. You had a button for punching, and for different types of punch, and you could also press up and down to shift your weight. So you pressed up to punch high and press down and then punch to punch low. And the idea wasn't necessarily to beat your opponent until they were out of energy, but to knock your opponent off the screen so you could scroll to the right and then eventually punch them into a manhole, at which point you would win, hooray, and then move on to the next one. This was a pretty slow, repetitive task though. Walk forward, punch, walk forward, punch, walk forward, punch was pretty much all there was to this. And yet for some reason, perhaps because of its early status as a Nintendo game and reasonably adventurous nature for the time, it was, Nintendo saw fit to then re-release this on Virtual Console every time Virtual Console was brought to a new platform. So for whatever reason, probably unjustly, Urban Champion has had a life, a 30-year life in the limelight, whereas really it should have had a few minutes. This really wasn't good, and the most notable part of it was it kind of formed the template for Nidhogg, which came out earlier on in the year and was the correct way to do this kind of two-person left to right convergence of platform game and fighter. What the West would know as Clu Clu Land, and really should probably be better pronounced in the Japanese form of Kuru Kuru Land. This was a sort of Pacman style mazy game, but the trick was in the Kuru Kuru part, the onomatopoeic word that means to rotate and spin round and around and around. The idea here was that you were controlling this little dude moving around the map, and you had to push the button to sort of extend an arm and use that to spin yourself around the pegs that made up the world here. It was just something that I couldn't get the hang of whatsoever. Put this in the Mappy file for me. Yeah, an interesting little maze game. And finally, and most famously of the four, Excitebike, which hit Famicom right at the end of November 1984. This would be probably the most popular of all the games that Nintendo released this month, a motorbike racing game in a side-on kind of view, and it was a lot of fun. For the most part, there were two different modes. One where you were racing on your own and you had to you had to get to the end of the track before the time ran out, and one where you were racing against other people on bikes. And you just had to go as fast as you could over some pretty difficult motocross-inspired terrain here. It was all about lining up your landings from jumps in order to conserve momentum and using your speed boost the right amount. If you held the button to boost your speed, you would of course get a little bit of pep going up those hills and over those jumps, but if you used it too much, your engine would overheat and you would be screwed. There was also a design mode here for creating your own tracks, and that was really something new and interesting, but of course, this being the Famicom and without battery backup in those days, once you turned off the machine, your track was lost. Eventually, later on, Excitebike would come out in a Famicom disk system flavor that would allow you to save those tracks, but the original Famicom release here and the NES release that headed west didn't allow that. But still, Excitebike, a game that had a lot of legs and really did deserve its reappearance on Virtual Console later on, unlike Urban Champion. Back in the UK and on the Spectrum, we had the ambitious Tir na Nog appearing here. This was a sort of open world action adventure thing, in a way kind of the Skyrim of its day. You were given this, you started out in a dungeon, you were a dude with long hair and not a shirt on to be seen, and not really any direction. Not even in the manual did it really give you any clue as to where you were supposed to be. Just kind of told to roam around this sort of rather bleak, featureless landscape, but for the time incredibly visually impressive, especially on the Spectrum. It was kind of unheard of at the time to have such a large central character, and certainly as we run around on the open plains here, parallax scrolling was nearly impossible on the Spectrum. But it was done, and in 1984 was hugely technically impressive. Perhaps not surprising then that the people that made this at Gargoyle Software would go on to be a part of Psygnosis, and Tir na Nog was supposed to be re-released on the PC in the early 90s, but that plan fell through, so we didn't get the visual update that perhaps it deserved. It did all kinds of weird things. That the way you moved about was left to right on a single sort of 2D side-scrolling plane, but you could also use buttons to rotate the camera such as it was around you through 90-degree increments, so that if you wanted to go, I don't know, into the screen, so to speak, you would have to rotate the screen so that what was I don't know, sort of into the screen or further, away from your character would now be to the right, and then you'd walk to the right. It had a weird control system that I couldn't quite get the hang of, and also it was just too big to sort of fiddle around and show off everything in the space of 2 minutes. But it was, it really was technically very, very impressive. It just required an awful lot from the player, unlike something like even Skyrim, which requires all the time in the world, but at least gives you modern accoutrements. The manual for Turn and Nog just recommends that you draw a map as you go, and eventually maps got published in magazines and such. But yeah, a really impressive game on the Specky in November '84. Finally was David Reedy's Skool Daze, based off his wife's experiences as a school teacher. This was another really ambitious game on the Specky, but in a different way to Tierna Nog. Here we had you in a kind of an open world, so to speak, just a much more confined one of being at school. This was a charming little game where you ran around in a school. You could name yourself and the other characters, so they'd be your schoolmates and your teachers, and you had to go through days at school and kind of every other pupil had their own AI routine, and you could sort of play to that and either become the most fearsome bully in the school or the most respected, and generally try and get by. But of course, what actually would turn out is that you'd catch measles and then you'd be thrown out of the game, so then you'd go back in and then just try and cause as much trouble as possible. And you really could. You could sort of throw things at other students, push them, punch them, sit on the floor, lie on the ground, throw things at the head teacher, try and get in the head teacher's office, get told off for that. You could actually get expelled in the game. Every time you did something wrong, you would get given lines to do, and if you had more than 10,000 lines, which was the limit of what could be displayed on the screen, you would be expelled, and the game was over. There isn't really that much to it now if you're looking back at it, but it was a really charming little simulation, and the fact that everybody in the game had their own little AI routine was quite impressive. And it was full of nice little details. You could write on the blackboards, you could sit in on lessons or run away from them and get into trouble for it, and it's all just it's kind of a nice, fun, charming little life sim. And I suppose Skool Daze was coming out around the same time, or was followed briefly afterwards by Little Computer People, which set the sort of basis for The Sims in many a way. So yeah, I mean, lots of interesting things were coming out on the 8-bits at the time, and Skool Daze was one of them, and understandably really fondly remembered by a lot of people that played this as kids. There was a sequel, Back to School, but apart from that, it never really went anywhere. But I guess the real sort of spirit of Skool Daze existed in something like Bully, Rockstar's game, which is another one that people are clamoring for a follow-up to. Still, it just seems that these days games set in schools, for whatever reason, people don't believe that they sell, or they might be somewhat controversial or what have you. But Skool Daze, like Bully in many a way, was just a charming sort of little snippet of life and an awful lot of fun. So that rounds out November 1984. You can check the full written feature and a full written retrospective on November 1984, November 1994, and November 2004 over on kaijupop.com.